In the shimmering heat of the ancient world, where the Nile River carved its eternal path through golden sands, there lived a woman whose name would echo through the corridors of time, long after the last pharaoh's crown had turned to dust. The Mediterranean breeze carried whispers of her beauty across marble halls and temple courtyards, while the stars that had guided Egyptian kings for millennia bore witness to her rise and fall. She was Cleopatra, the seventh Philopator, the last active pharaoh of Ptolemaic Egypt, and her story begins not with her birth, but with the long shadow of history that would shape her destiny. The ancient city of Alexandria rose from the Mediterranean coast like a jewel carved from dreams and ambition. Founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE, it had become the crown of the Hellenistic world, where the wisdom of Greece merged with the mysteries of Egypt under the watchful gaze of the lighthouse that would become one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. The harbour bustled with ships from every corner of the known world, their holds heavy with spices from India, silk from the distant east, and gold from the heart of Africa. Here, in this cosmopolitan marvel, the great library of Alexandria housed the collected knowledge of humanity, its scrolls containing the thoughts of philosophers, the calculations of mathematicians, and the poems of lovers long forgotten. When Ptolemy I, one of Alexander's most trusted generals, claimed Egypt as his prize following his master's death, he established a dynasty that would endure for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies were not native Egyptians, but Macedonian Greeks, yet they adopted the ancient customs of the pharaohs, marrying their siblings to preserve the purity of their bloodline and ruling as living gods in the eyes of their subjects. They spoke Greek in their palaces, but learned to navigate the complex religious traditions that had sustained Egypt through the rise and fall of empires, stretching back to the dawn of recorded history. The Egypt into which Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE was a realm caught between its glorious past and an uncertain future. The pyramids of Giza stood as eternal monuments to a time when Egypt had ruled the known world, their limestone blocks weathered by millennia of desert winds, yet still inspiring awe in all who gazed upon them. The temples along the Nile, with their towering columns and intricate hieroglyphs, continued to function as centers of worship, learning, and economic power. Priests conducted the same rituals their ancestors had performed for thousands of years, offering prayers to gods whose names predated the rise of Greece and Rome. Yet shadows gathered on the political horizon. Rome, once a distant republic preoccupied with Mediterranean trade and territorial expansion, had grown into a military and economic giant whose influence extended from Britain to the borders of Parthia. Roman merchants walked the streets of Alexandria. Roman gold filled the coffers of Egyptian temples, and Roman political intrigue began to influence the succession disputes that periodically racked the Ptolemaic court. The balance of power in the Mediterranean was shifting, and Egypt found itself increasingly dependent on Roman goodwill to maintain its independence. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, had learned this lesson through bitter experience. Early in his reign, he had been forced to flee Egypt when his subjects rebelled against his heavy taxation and his perceived subservience to Rome. Only with Roman military support had he been able to reclaim his throne, a restoration that came at the cost of enormous tribute payments that strained Egypt's treasury. The young Cleopatra watched and learned as her father navigated these treacherous waters, balancing the expectations of his Egyptian subjects with the demands of his Roman creditors. The princess received an education befitting her station and her times. She learned to read and write in Greek, the language of her ancestors and the lingua franca of the educated Mediterranean world. But unlike many of her Ptolemaic predecessors, Cleopatra also mastered the ancient Egyptian language, becoming the first pharaoh in 3 centuries who could speak directly to her native subjects without interpreters. She studied rhetoric and philosophy, mathematics and astronomy, history and literature. The great library of Alexandria served as her classroom, its vast collection of scrolls providing her with access to the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world. Her tutors taught her the art of governance, explaining the complex system of bureaucracy that administered Egypt's vast agricultural wealth. She learned about the annual flooding of the Nile, which deposited fertile silt across the river valley and made Egypt the granary of the Mediterranean world. She studied the religious calendar that governed Egyptian life, understanding how the pharaoh served not merely as a political ruler, but as the earthly representative of the goddess Isis and the god Horus. The young princess discovered that kingship in Egypt was as much about spiritual authority as temporal power, a lesson that would serve her well in the years to come. As Cleopatra matured, the political situation in both Egypt and Rome continued to evolve. In Rome, the old republican institutions struggled to govern an empire that stretched across 3 continents. Ambitious generals and politicians formed shifting alliances, their rivalries often spilling over into civil war. Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Marcus Licinius Crassus had formed the first triumvirate, an unofficial alliance that effectively controlled Roman politics through a combination of military might, political cunning, and enormous wealth. When Crassus died in a disastrous campaign against the Parthians, the delicate balance between Caesar and Pompey began to collapse. In 51 BCE, when Cleopatra was 18 years old, her father died and left the throne of Egypt to her and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, who was only 10 years old. According to Ptolemaic tradition, the siblings were married and were expected to rule jointly, though the marriage was purely ceremonial and political. From the beginning, however, tensions emerged between Cleopatra and the advisors who surrounded her young brother husband. These men, led by the eunuch Pothinus, the general Achillas, and the tutor Theodotus, represented the traditional Ptolemaic approach to governance, favoring accommodation with Rome and the maintenance of existing power structures. Cleopatra, however, had different ideas. She understood that Egypt's future depended not on passive submission to Roman power, but on active engagement with Roman politics. She believed that Egypt could maintain its independence and prosperity by becoming an indispensable ally to the right Roman leader at the right moment. This vision required her to take risks that the conservative court advisors found alarming and dangerous. The young queen demonstrated her political acumen early in her reign. When poor Nile floods led to famine in Upper Egypt, she personally traveled to the affected regions to oversee relief efforts and to show herself to her subjects. These journeys served multiple purposes. They allowed her to assess the situation firsthand. They demonstrated her commitment to the welfare of her people, and they provided opportunities for her to practice the Egyptian language and customs that connected her to the native population in ways her predecessors had often neglected. Cleopatra's relationship with her brother and his advisors deteriorated steadily during the first 3 years of their joint reign. The queen advocated for more aggressive policies toward Rome, arguing that Egypt should position itself as an active player in Roman politics, rather than a passive recipient of Roman demands. Her brother's advisors, believing that such a course would lead to disaster, began to marginalize Cleopatra and to concentrate power in their own hands. By 48 BCE, the conflict had escalated to the point where Cleopatra was forced to flee Egypt and take refuge in Syria, where she began gathering an army to reclaim her throne. Meanwhile, the Roman world was convulsing in civil war. Julius Caesar had crossed the Rubicon River with his legions in 49 BCE, effectively declaring war on the Roman Senate and his former ally Pompey the Great. The conflict that followed would determine not only the future of Rome, but also the fate of every kingdom and territory within Rome's sphere of influence. Caesar's military genius and political cunning had given him the advantage, and by 48 BCE, he had driven Pompey from Italy and was pursuing him across the Mediterranean. It was at this crucial moment that Cleopatra made the decision that would define the rest of her life and reign. Rather than remaining neutral in the Roman civil war or supporting Pompey, as her brother's advisors had chosen to do, she decided to gamble everything on Caesar. The calculation was bold and dangerous. If Caesar lost, Egypt would face the wrath of the victorious Pompey and his allies. If Caesar won, however, Egypt might find itself in the enviable position of being allied with the most powerful man in the Roman world. The famous story of Cleopatra's first meeting with Caesar, in which she supposedly had herself smuggled into his presence wrapped in a carpet or bed linen, may be more legend than fact, but it captures something essential about her character and her approach to politics. She understood that personal relationships were crucial to political success in the ancient world, and she was prepared to use every weapon at her disposal, including her intelligence, her charm, and yes, her beauty, to achieve her goals. When Cleopatra appeared before Caesar in Alexandria in 48 BCE, she was 21 years old and at the height of her powers. Contemporary sources suggest that while she may not have been conventionally beautiful by the standards of her time, she possessed a compelling presence and extraordinary intelligence that made her irresistible to those who encountered her. Plutarch, writing more than a century later, described her as having an irresistible charm and noted that the attraction of her person, joining with the charm of her conversation and the character that attended all she said or did, was something bewitching. Caesar, who was 52 years old and one of the most experienced politicians and generals of his generation, was immediately taken with the young queen. Their relationship quickly became both personal and political, a partnership that would serve the interests of both Egypt and Rome. Caesar helped Cleopatra defeat her brother's forces and secure her position as the sole ruler of Egypt. In return, Egypt provided Caesar with the resources he needed to continue his military campaigns and to consolidate his power in Rome. The alliance between Caesar and Cleopatra scandalized many Romans, who viewed it as evidence of Caesar's corruption by foreign influences. The Romans had a deep-seated prejudice against monarchy and viewed the relationship between a Roman general and an Eastern queen as a betrayal of Roman values. These criticisms would follow Caesar for the rest of his life and would ultimately contribute to his assassination in 44 BCE. For Cleopatra, however, the relationship with Caesar provided exactly what she had hoped: protection for Egypt and a pathway to influence Roman politics. During Caesar's stay in Alexandria, which lasted for several months, Cleopatra became pregnant with his child. The son who was born to them, whom she named Caesarion, would become both a symbol of the union between Egypt and Rome and a potential threat to Augustus and the other Roman leaders who would come to power after Caesar's death. Caesar never formally acknowledged Caesarion as his son, but he also never denied the paternity, and Cleopatra would spend the rest of her life promoting the boy's claim to be Caesar's heir. The months that Caesar spent in Egypt were not merely a romantic interlude, but a crucial period of political and military preparation. Caesar was still fighting a civil war against Pompey and his allies, and he needed Egypt's wealth and resources to fund his continuing campaigns. Cleopatra provided generous financial support for Caesar's military efforts, understanding that his success was essential to her own survival. The queen also used this time to consolidate her own power within Egypt, eliminating potential rivals and strengthening her relationship with the Egyptian priesthood and the native population. When Caesar finally left Egypt in 47 BCE to continue his military campaigns, he left behind a small Roman garrison to protect Cleopatra from any internal threats. This force was both a symbol of Roman support and a subtle reminder of Egypt's dependence on Roman power. Cleopatra understood the implications perfectly and began planning for the day when she would need to navigate Roman politics without Caesar's direct protection. The next few years were a period of relative stability for Egypt under Cleopatra's rule. She focused on strengthening her kingdom's economy and military while carefully monitoring the evolving political situation in Rome. Caesar's victories over the remaining forces of Pompey and his allies had made him the undisputed master of the Roman world, but his growing power had also created new enemies among the Roman aristocracy. Cleopatra likely understood that Caesar's position, while dominant, was also precarious, and she began to consider what alternatives might be available if he were to fall from power. In 46 BCE, Cleopatra traveled to Rome at Caesar's invitation, bringing with her the young Caesarion and a magnificent entourage that displayed Egypt's wealth and sophistication to the Roman people. Her arrival caused a sensation in the Roman capital, where exotic Eastern queens were the stuff of legend and fantasy. She took up residence in one of Caesar's properties across the Tiber River and held court there, receiving Roman nobles and intellectuals who were curious to meet the famous Egyptian queen. Cleopatra's stay in Rome served multiple purposes. It allowed her to study Roman politics and society firsthand, giving her insights that would prove invaluable in her future dealings with Roman leaders. It also provided an opportunity for her to present herself as a sophisticated and cultured ruler, rather than the stereotypical barbarian queen that many Romans expected. She patronized Roman artists and intellectuals, funded public works, and generally conducted herself in a manner calculated to win respect and admiration from the Roman elite. The relationship between Caesar and Cleopatra during this period was complex and multifaceted. They were clearly lovers and political allies, but they were also careful to maintain their independence and to pursue their own distinct interests. Caesar needed Cleopatra's wealth and Egypt's resources, but he also had to be mindful of Roman public opinion and the growing concerns about his relationship with a foreign queen. Cleopatra, for her part, valued Caesar's protection and the opportunities that their alliance provided, but she also understood that she needed to prepare for a future in which Caesar might not be available to protect her interests. The assassination of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March in 44 BCE changed everything for both Rome and Egypt. Cleopatra, who was still in Rome when Caesar was murdered, immediately understood that her position had become extremely dangerous. The conspirators who had killed Caesar viewed her as a symbol of his corruption and his abandonment of Roman values. If they succeeded in seizing power, she would likely face execution or exile. Even if Caesar's supporters managed to maintain control, the political situation would be chaotic and unpredictable for months or years to come. Cleopatra fled Rome quickly after Caesar's assassination, taking Caesarion with her and racing back to the safety of Alexandria. The journey was fraught with danger, as Roman ships and soldiers loyal to the conspirators might have intercepted her at any point. Her successful escape demonstrated both her political intelligence and her ability to make quick decisions under pressure, qualities that would serve her well in the turbulent years that followed. Back in Egypt, Cleopatra faced the challenge of maintaining her kingdom's independence in a Roman world that had suddenly become much more hostile to her interests. Caesar's death had left a power vacuum in Rome that was being filled by competing factions, each with its own agenda and its own attitude toward Egypt. Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, the leaders of the conspiracy against Caesar, controlled much of the eastern Mediterranean and demanded tribute from Egypt to fund their military campaigns. At the same time, Mark Antony and Octavian, Caesar's former lieutenants, were gathering their own forces and making their own demands on Egypt's resources. The young queen found herself in an almost impossible position. Supporting any one Roman faction meant making enemies of the others, but remaining neutral was also dangerous, as it might be interpreted as disloyalty by whichever faction ultimately emerged victorious. Cleopatra chose a careful middle course, providing minimal support to Brutus and Cassius, while secretly maintaining contact with Antony and Octavian. She understood that the civil war would eventually produce a winner, and she wanted to be in a position to ally herself with that winner when the time came. The Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE resolved the immediate crisis by destroying the forces of Brutus and Cassius and leaving Mark Antony and Octavian as the dominant powers in the Roman world. The two men divided the empire between them, with Octavian taking control of the West and Antony assuming responsibility for the East. For Cleopatra, this division was both an opportunity and a danger. Antony's control of the eastern Mediterranean meant that Egypt's fate would largely be determined by her relationship with him, but it also meant that she would be dealing with a Roman leader who had his own ambitions and his own agenda. Mark Antony was in many ways the opposite of Julius Caesar. Where Caesar had been calculating and controlled, Antony was passionate and impulsive. Where Caesar had been intellectually curious and culturally sophisticated, Antony was more interested in military glory and sensual pleasures. Yet Antony was also a formidable general and politician, a man who had been Caesar's most trusted lieutenant and who commanded the loyalty of veteran legions throughout the eastern Mediterranean. If Cleopatra could win Antony's support, she would have a powerful protector for Egypt. If she failed to do so, she might find herself facing a Roman invasion. In 41 BCE, Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in the city of Tarsus in modern-day Turkey. The summons was presented as a formal command from a Roman magistrate to a subordinate ruler. But Cleopatra understood that her response to this invitation would determine the future of her kingdom. She could have refused to come, asserting Egypt's independence and dignity, but such a refusal would almost certainly have led to war with Rome. Alternatively, she could have appeared before Antony as a supplicant, acknowledging Egypt's subordinate status, but potentially earning his protection. Instead, Cleopatra chose a third option that demonstrated her political genius and her understanding of psychology and theatre. She would go to Tarsus, but she would go as an equal, not as a subordinate. The famous description of her arrival, recorded by Plutarch, captures the careful calculation behind what appeared to be a spectacular display of wealth and power. Cleopatra arrived at Tarsus aboard a magnificent golden barge, its purple sails billowing in the Mediterranean breeze, and its silver oars keeping time to the music of flutes and harps. She herself was dressed as Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, surrounded by attendants costumed as sea nymphs and cupids. The entire spectacle was designed to overwhelm the senses and to present Cleopatra not as a mere mortal queen, but as a goddess descended to earth. The crowds that gathered along the riverbank to watch her arrival were dazzled by the display, and word of the Egyptian queen's magnificence quickly spread throughout the city. The meeting between Antony and Cleopatra at Tarsus became one of the most famous encounters in ancient history, a moment when politics and passion, calculation and desire combined to shape the destiny of empires. Antony, who had expected to receive a nervous and submissive vassal, instead found himself confronted by a woman who presented herself as his equal and who clearly expected to be treated as such. The queen's intelligence, her cultural sophistication, and her evident wealth made an immediate impression on the Roman general, who was himself a lover of luxury and spectacle. Their relationship developed quickly from political alliance to personal passion. Like Caesar before him, Antony was captivated by Cleopatra's charm and intelligence. But where Caesar had maintained a certain emotional distance and had continued to pursue his Roman political ambitions, alongside his relationship with the Egyptian queen, Antony allowed himself to become completely absorbed in his partnership with Cleopatra. He spent the winter of 41 to 40 BCE in Alexandria, neglecting his Roman responsibilities and immersing himself in the luxurious and cultured life of the Ptolemaic court. The months that Antony spent in Alexandria were a time of great happiness for both him and Cleopatra. They established a society called the Inimitable Livers, dedicated to the pursuit of pleasure and luxury. They hunted together in the Egyptian desert, sailed together on the Nile, and hosted elaborate banquets that became legendary for their extravagance. Plutarch tells stories of dinners that cost enormous sums, of pearls dissolved in wine, and of competitions in magnificence that demonstrated the vast wealth of Egypt and the sophisticated culture of Alexandria. Yet beneath the pleasure and luxury, serious political business was being conducted. Cleopatra provided Antony with the financial resources he needed to maintain his position in the Eastern Mediterranean and to fund his military campaigns. In return, Antony offered Egypt protection from its enemies and recognition of Cleopatra's authority over territories that had been disputed between Egypt and Rome. The relationship was a genuine partnership, based on mutual advantage and shared interests as well as personal attraction. During this period, Cleopatra became pregnant with twins, whom she would name Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. The children were both symbols of the union between Egypt and Rome and potential heirs to vast territories stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Persian Gulf. Their very names suggested the global ambitions of their parents. Alexander recalled the great conqueror who had united East and West, while Helios and Selene represented the sun and moon, the celestial bodies that governed the entire world. The idyll in Alexandria could not last forever. Political pressures in Rome and throughout the Mediterranean demanded Antony's attention, and in 40 BCE, he was forced to leave Egypt to deal with a crisis in his relationship with Octavian. The two men were nominally allies, but their alliance was strained by mutual suspicion and competing ambitions. Octavian had been consolidating his power in the Western Mediterranean, while Antony had been occupied with Cleopatra, and tensions between their respective supporters had led to several minor conflicts. To resolve these tensions and to strengthen their alliance, Antony agreed to marry Octavian's sister, Octavia, in 40 BCE. The marriage was purely political, designed to cement the relationship between the two Roman leaders, but it also represented a betrayal of Cleopatra and a potential threat to her interests. If Antony's Roman marriage proved successful and produced children, the Egyptian queen might find herself relegated to the status of a mere concubine, her own children displaced in favor of Antony's Roman heirs. Cleopatra responded to this crisis with characteristic intelligence and patience. Rather than raging against Antony's marriage or attempting to sabotage his relationship with Octavia, she withdrew to Egypt and focused on strengthening her own position. She used the resources that Antony had provided to modernize Egypt's military, to expand its trade relationships, and to consolidate her authority over the Egyptian priesthood and the native population. She also began preparing for the possibility that her alliance with Antony might not survive the pressures of Roman politics. For 3 years, from 40 to 37 BCE, Antony attempted to balance his Roman responsibilities with his attachment to Cleopatra. He lived with Octavia in Rome and accompanied her on various ceremonial occasions, but he also maintained secret contact with the Egyptian queen and continued to rely on Egypt's wealth to fund his political and military activities. This delicate balancing act became increasingly difficult to maintain as Octavian grew more suspicious of Antony's motives and more critical of his relationship with foreign allies. In 37 BCE, the balance finally collapsed. Antony abandoned his wife Octavia and returned to Cleopatra in Alexandria, effectively declaring that his loyalty lay with Egypt rather than Rome. The reunion between Antony and Cleopatra was passionate and joyful, but it also marked the beginning of a final phase in their relationship that would end in tragedy for both of them and for the Kingdom of Egypt. The years from 37 to 31 BCE were a time of increasing tension between Antony and Octavian, tension that gradually escalated into open civil war. Antony and Cleopatra spent these years preparing for the conflict they knew was coming, gathering allies, building fleets, and attempting to present their cause as a war for the liberation of the East from Roman oppression rather than a mere personal conflict between Roman generals. During this period, Cleopatra gave birth to another son by Antony, whom they named Ptolemy Philadelphus. With Caesarion, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, the queen now had 4 children who represented her hopes for the future and her connections to the most powerful Roman leaders of her generation. Each child was a potential heir to Egypt and a living symbol of the union between East and West that Cleopatra believed represented the future of the Mediterranean world. In 34 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra staged a magnificent ceremony in Alexandria known as the Donations of Alexandria. In this elaborate pageant, Antony formally recognized Cleopatra as the Queen of Kings and assigned various territories throughout the Eastern Mediterranean to her and to their children. Caesarion was proclaimed the heir to Egypt and the rightful successor to Julius Caesar. Alexander Helios was given Armenia, Media, and Parthia. Cleopatra Selene received Cyrenaica and Libya. Ptolemy Philadelphus was assigned Syria and Cilicia. The ceremony was a brilliant piece of political theatre designed to present Antony and Cleopatra as the legitimate rulers of a new Eastern Empire that would rival Rome itself. The royal family appeared in elaborate costumes that combined Roman, Greek, and Egyptian elements, symbolizing their role as heirs to all the great civilizations of the ancient world. The event was witnessed by ambassadors from throughout the Mediterranean, ensuring that news of the ceremony would spread quickly to Rome and to other potential allies and enemies. Octavian used the Donations of Alexandria as evidence of Antony's betrayal of Roman interests and values. In speeches to the Roman Senate and people, he portrayed Antony as a man who had been corrupted by foreign influences, and who was now prepared to hand over Roman territories to an Egyptian queen and her bastard children. The propaganda campaign was effective in turning Roman public opinion against Antony and in justifying the civil war that Octavian was preparing to launch. The war between Octavian and Antony was not merely a personal conflict, but a struggle between two different visions of the future of the Mediterranean world. Octavian represented traditional Roman values and the primacy of Rome over all other cities and kingdoms. Antony and Cleopatra, by contrast, offered a more cosmopolitan vision in which East and West would be united under their joint rule, with Alexandria serving as a rival to Rome and the ancient kingdoms of the Mediterranean enjoying a renaissance under enlightened monarchical government. Both sides spent years preparing for the final confrontation. Octavian used his control of Rome and the Western Mediterranean to gather resources and to build a propaganda campaign that portrayed the coming war as a conflict between Roman patriotism and foreign corruption. Antony and Cleopatra used Egypt's wealth and their connections throughout the East to assemble a coalition of allies and to build a powerful fleet that they hoped would give them control of the Mediterranean. The decisive battle came in 31 BCE at Actium, a promontory on the western coast of Greece, where Antony and Cleopatra had established a fortified naval base. The Battle of Actium was one of the most important naval engagements in ancient history, a conflict that would determine not only the fate of the participants, but the future course of Western civilization. The battle itself was a complex affair involving hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his skilled admiral Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, was smaller than the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra, but was more maneuverable and better coordinated. The Egyptian and allied ships were larger and more heavily armed, but proved difficult to control in the confused melee of naval combat. The turning point in the battle came when Cleopatra's squadron, perhaps seeing that the battle was going badly, or perhaps acting on a predetermined plan, suddenly broke away from the main engagement and sailed away toward Egypt. Antony, seeing Cleopatra's ships departing, abandoned his own flagship and followed her, leaving his remaining forces to continue the battle without their commander. The departure of Antony and Cleopatra from the Battle of Actium has been the subject of debate among historians for more than 2,000 years. Some sources suggest that it was a planned strategic withdrawal, intended to preserve their forces for continued resistance from Egypt. Others portray it as a moment of panic or cowardice, in which both leaders abandoned their followers in order to save themselves. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. The battle was clearly going badly for Antony and Cleopatra, and their withdrawal may have been a desperate attempt to preserve some hope of eventual victory. Whatever the motivation, the departure of Antony and Cleopatra from Actium was a catastrophe for their cause. The remaining ships and soldiers, demoralized by the apparent abandonment of their leaders, were quickly defeated or surrendered to Octavian. The victory gave Octavian control of the Mediterranean and left Antony and Cleopatra isolated in Egypt with no realistic hope of military success. The final year of Cleopatra's life, from the Battle of Actium in September 31 BCE to her death in August 30 BCE, was a period of desperate but ultimately futile attempts to find some escape from the consequences of defeat. She and Antony tried various strategies. They attempted to negotiate with Octavian, offering to abdicate in favor of their children. They considered fleeing to India or some other distant land beyond Roman reach. They even explored the possibility of a final military campaign that might somehow reverse their fortunes. None of these strategies offered any real hope of success. Octavian was determined to eliminate both Antony and Cleopatra as potential threats to his rule, and he had the military strength to pursue them wherever they might flee. The other kingdoms and cities of the Mediterranean, recognizing that Octavian was now the undisputed master of the Roman world, hastened to abandon their former allies and to seek accommodation with the victor. During these final months, Cleopatra demonstrated the same intelligence and determination that had characterized her entire reign. She used her remaining resources to ensure the safety of her children, sending Caesarion to India and making arrangements for the care of her other children. She also began planning her own death, understanding that suicide might be preferable to capture and the humiliation of being paraded through Rome in Octavian's triumph. When Octavian's forces finally reached Alexandria in August 30 BCE, Antony attempted one last desperate battle but was quickly defeated. Believing that Cleopatra was already dead, he fell on his sword in the Roman manner. He was carried dying to the mausoleum where Cleopatra had taken refuge, and there he died in her arms, ending one of the great love stories of ancient history. Cleopatra survived Antony by only a few days. Octavian, recognizing her intelligence and her potential value as a symbol of his victory, attempted to keep her alive for his triumph in Rome, but the queen had no intention of being displayed as a captive before the Roman crowds who had so often mocked her relationship with Caesar and Antony. On August 30th, 30 BCE, she committed suicide in her mausoleum, probably by allowing a poisonous snake to bite her, though the exact method of her death remains uncertain. With Cleopatra's death, the Ptolemaic dynasty came to an end after nearly 3 centuries of rule. Egypt became a Roman province, its vast wealth flowing to Rome to fund Octavian's transformation of the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire. The last independent kingdom of the ancient world had fallen, and the Mediterranean had become, in Roman terms, Mare Nostrum, our sea. The immediate aftermath of Cleopatra's death was brutal for her family and supporters. Caesarion, despite Cleopatra's efforts to send him to safety, was captured and executed on Octavian's orders. The other children were spared, but were taken to Rome to be raised in Octavian's household. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus disappear from the historical record and presumably died young. Only Cleopatra Selene survived to adulthood, eventually marrying Juba II of Numidia and becoming a queen in her own right, thus preserving something of her mother's bloodline and legacy. The transformation of Egypt from an independent kingdom to a Roman province brought significant changes to the land of the pharaohs. The Romans, recognizing Egypt's crucial importance as a source of grain for the city of Rome, governed it carefully and efficiently. They maintained the existing administrative system in many respects, but placed it under the direct control of a Roman prefect who reported directly to the emperor. The ancient temples continued to function, but they were increasingly subordinated to Roman authority and Roman interests. The city of Alexandria, which had served as the capital of the Ptolemaic kingdom and one of the great centers of learning and culture in the ancient world, gradually declined under Roman rule. The Great Library, which had once housed the largest collection of scrolls in the ancient world, lost its preeminence as scholarship and learning shifted to Rome and other centers. The museum, where scholars had conducted research in mathematics, astronomy, geography, and medicine, continued to exist but never again achieved the same level of innovation and discovery that had characterized the Hellenistic period. Yet even as Egypt itself was transformed by Roman rule, the memory and legend of Cleopatra began to take on a life of their own. Roman writers, beginning with the poets and historians of the Augustan age, created a literary image of the Egyptian queen that emphasized her beauty, her sexuality, and her dangerous foreignness. This image, which owed as much to Roman prejudices and anxieties as to historical fact, would influence depictions of Cleopatra for centuries to come. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing nearly a century after Cleopatra's death, reflected the official Roman view when he described her as a woman who had used her feminine wiles to corrupt two of Rome's greatest generals and who had represented a threat to Roman values and institutions. This interpretation, which portrayed Cleopatra as a seductress rather than a capable ruler, served the political needs of the Roman Empire by justifying the conquest of Egypt and by reinforcing Roman stereotypes about the inherent weakness and corruption of Eastern monarchies. Yet even Roman sources could not entirely suppress evidence of Cleopatra's real accomplishments and abilities. Plutarch, writing in the 2nd century CE, provided a more nuanced portrait that acknowledged her intelligence, her political skill, and her genuine devotion to Egypt's interests. His account of her death, in particular, emphasized her dignity and courage in the face of defeat, qualities that Romans could admire even in an enemy. As the Roman Empire itself evolved and eventually declined, new interpretations of Cleopatra began to emerge. Christian writers of the late Empire often used her as an example of the dangers of worldly ambition and sensual pleasure, but they also sometimes acknowledged her as a capable ruler who had defended her kingdom against foreign conquest. Medieval writers, with limited access to original sources, often transformed her into a figure of romance and legend, emphasizing her beauty and her tragic love affairs while paying less attention to her political achievements. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical antiquity and new scholarly attention to ancient sources. Humanist scholars began to examine the original Greek and Roman accounts of Cleopatra's life and reign, leading to more historically accurate depictions that recognized her as a serious political figure rather than merely a beautiful temptress. The invention of printing allowed these new interpretations to reach a wider audience, and Cleopatra began to appear in works of literature, art, and drama that explored the complexities of her character and her historical significance. William Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, written in the early 17th century, represented perhaps the greatest literary treatment of the Egyptian queen's story. Shakespeare drew on Plutarch's account, but transformed the historical narrative into a profound meditation on love, power, and the clash between duty and desire. His Cleopatra was neither the simple seductress of Roman propaganda, nor the purely virtuous queen of some medieval romances, but a complex character whose political intelligence and passionate nature made her both admirable and tragic. The Enlightenment brought new methods of historical scholarship and renewed interest in understanding the past on its own terms, rather than through the lens of contemporary moral and political concerns. Scholars began to examine Cleopatra's reign in the context of Hellenistic political culture and to recognize her as a representative of the sophisticated civilization that had flourished in Alexandria and other Eastern cities. This more analytical approach led to a greater appreciation of her achievements as a ruler and her significance as a historical figure. The 19th century saw the emergence of new archaeological evidence that began to flesh out the material culture of Ptolemaic Egypt. Excavations in Alexandria and other Egyptian sites revealed inscriptions, coins, and architectural remains that provided direct evidence of Cleopatra's reign and the world in which she lived. The decipherment of hieroglyphic writing by Jean-François Champollion in the 1820s opened up new sources of information about ancient Egypt. and allowed scholars to study Egyptian texts that had been written during Cleopatra's lifetime. As European powers expanded their influence into the Middle East and North Africa during the colonial period, interest in Cleopatra and ancient Egypt reached new heights. The construction of the Suez Canal in the 1860s made Egypt a crucial strategic location for European commerce and military power, and the discovery of spectacular archaeological sites, like the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, captured the popular imagination and reinforced the association between Egypt and mystery, wealth, and exotic beauty. Modern archaeological research has continued to expand our understanding of Cleopatra's world and to challenge some of the myths and legends that have surrounded her story. Recent discoveries in Alexandria, including the possible location of her tomb, have provided new insights into the architecture and urban planning of the Ptolemaic capital. Studies of economic and administrative documents have revealed the sophisticated bureaucratic system that governed Egypt during her reign, and the complex network of trade relationships that connected Egypt to the broader Mediterranean world. DNA analysis and other scientific techniques have also begun to shed light on the ethnicity and appearance of the Ptolemaic royal family. While the question of Cleopatra's racial identity remains a subject of scholarly debate, the evidence suggests that she was primarily of Macedonian Greek ancestry, with some possible Egyptian and other Middle Eastern ancestry through her mother's line. This genetic heritage reflected the multicultural nature of the Hellenistic world and the complex patterns of intermarriage and cultural exchange that characterized the ancient Mediterranean. Modern feminist scholarship has brought new perspectives to the study of Cleopatra, emphasizing her agency as a political actor and challenging traditional interpretations that have focused primarily on her relationships with Roman men. Scholars have examined her use of religious imagery and Egyptian symbolism to legitimize her rule, her economic policies, and their impact on Egypt's prosperity, and her diplomatic strategies in dealing with Rome and other Mediterranean powers. These new approaches have revealed Cleopatra as a sophisticated ruler who successfully governed Egypt for nearly 2 decades, maintained the kingdom's independence during a period of Roman expansion, and left a lasting impact on the culture and politics of the ancient world. Her reign represented the final flowering of Hellenistic civilization, a synthesis of Greek, Egyptian, and Roman influences that produced remarkable achievements in science, literature, art, and governance. The economic policies implemented during Cleopatra's reign demonstrated her understanding of Egypt's unique position in the ancient world economy. Egypt's agriculture, based on the annual flooding of the Nile, was extraordinarily productive and provided the foundation for the kingdom's wealth. The Queen maintained careful control over the grain trade, ensuring that Egypt's agricultural surplus could be used both to feed the population and to generate revenue through exports to other Mediterranean regions. Cleopatra also promoted trade and commerce through policies that encouraged foreign merchants to operate in Egyptian ports and markets. Alexandria's position at the intersection of Africa, Asia, and Europe made it a natural center for international trade, and the Queen's administration worked to maintain the infrastructure and security necessary for commercial activity. The famous Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, served not only as a navigational aid, but as a symbol of Egypt's commitment to facilitating maritime trade. The Queen's cultural policies reflected her understanding of Egypt's diverse population and the need to maintain the loyalty of both the Greek-speaking urban elite and the Egyptian-speaking rural population. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in 3 centuries to learn the Egyptian language and she participated in traditional Egyptian religious ceremonies that connected her to thousands of years of pharaonic tradition. At the same time, she maintained Alexandria as a center of Greek learning and culture, supporting the work of scholars, poets, and scientists who contributed to the intellectual life of the Hellenistic world. Cleopatra's religious policies were particularly sophisticated, reflecting her understanding of the role that religion played in ancient politics and society. She presented herself as the reincarnation of the goddess Isis, the most popular deity in the ancient Mediterranean world, and used this religious identity to enhance her political authority, both within Egypt and in her dealings with foreign powers. Her identification with Isis also allowed her to appeal to women throughout the Mediterranean world, as the goddess was associated with marriage, motherhood, and the protection of women and children. The architectural and artistic achievements of Cleopatra's reign reflected the wealth and cultural sophistication of Ptolemaic Egypt. She funded the construction of new temples and the restoration of existing religious sites throughout Egypt, projects that served both religious and political purposes. These building projects provided employment for thousands of workers and artisans, stimulated the local economy, and demonstrated the Queen's commitment to maintaining Egypt's ancient traditions. The palace complex in Alexandria, where Cleopatra held court, was reportedly one of the most magnificent architectural achievements of the ancient world. Contemporary accounts describe vast halls decorated with precious stones and metals, gardens filled with exotic plants and animals, and libraries containing hundreds of thousands of scrolls. The palace served not only as a residence for the royal family, but as a center of government, diplomacy, and cultural activity. Cleopatra's court attracted scholars, artists, and intellectuals from throughout the Mediterranean world. The Queen herself was reported to be highly educated and intellectually curious, capable of discussing philosophy, mathematics, and literature with the leading thinkers of her time. This intellectual environment contributed to significant advances in astronomy, medicine, geography, and other fields during her reign. The Queen's military policies demonstrated her understanding of the changing nature of warfare in the ancient world. She invested heavily in naval forces, recognizing that control of the Mediterranean sea lanes was crucial for Egypt's security and prosperity. The ships of the Egyptian fleet were among the largest and most advanced of their time, incorporating the latest developments in naval architecture and weaponry. Cleopatra also modernized Egypt's land forces, introducing new weapons and tactics that reflected the influence of Roman military innovations. She recognized that Egypt's traditional military advantages, based on wealth and defensive geography, would not be sufficient in an era of aggressive Roman expansion. Her military preparations ultimately proved insufficient to defeat Octavian's forces, but they did allow Egypt to maintain its independence for nearly 2 decades longer than might otherwise have been possible. The Queen's diplomatic strategies were complex and sophisticated, reflecting her understanding of the intricate web of alliances and rivalries that characterized Mediterranean politics in the 1st century BCE. She maintained relationships with numerous kingdoms and city-states throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, providing financial support and military assistance in exchange for political cooperation and mutual defense agreements. Cleopatra's relationship with the Jewish community in Alexandria and throughout Egypt was particularly important, as Jews constituted a significant minority population in many Egyptian cities. She generally maintained good relations with Jewish leaders and supported their religious and cultural activities, understanding that their loyalty was crucial for internal stability. and that their commercial networks provided valuable connections throughout the Mediterranean world. The Queen's diplomatic relations with other female rulers of her time reflected both the opportunities and challenges faced by women in positions of political power in the ancient world. She maintained correspondence with Queen Dynamis of the Bosporus, Queen Pythodorida of Pontus, and other female monarchs, creating a network of mutual support and cooperation that transcended traditional ethnic and political boundaries. As Cleopatra's reign drew to its close, she faced the challenge of ensuring the continuity of her dynasty and the preservation of Egypt's independence. Her efforts to promote her children as legitimate heirs to both Egyptian and Roman authority represented a sophisticated attempt to navigate the complex political realities of the late Republican period. Although these efforts ultimately failed, they demonstrated her understanding of the need to adapt ancient institutions to new circumstances. The Queen's final years were marked by her recognition that the old order of independent kingdoms and city-states was giving way to a new era of imperial domination. Her alliance with Mark Antony represented not just a personal relationship, but a strategic attempt to create an alternative power structure that could compete with Rome on equal terms. The failure of this alliance marked the end of an era in Mediterranean history and the beginning of centuries of Roman dominance. The legacy of Cleopatra's reign extended far beyond her own lifetime and the immediate political consequences of her defeat. Her example as a female ruler who successfully governed a major kingdom for nearly 2 decades provided inspiration for later generations of women who sought to exercise political power. Her synthesis of Greek, Egyptian, and Roman cultural elements created a model of cosmopolitan civilization that influenced art, literature, and political thought for centuries to come. The economic and administrative systems developed during Cleopatra's reign continued to function under Roman rule and contributed to Egypt's prosperity as a Roman province. The agricultural techniques, commercial networks, and bureaucratic institutions that she maintained or developed provided the foundation for Egypt's continued importance as a source of grain and other commodities for the Roman Empire. The religious and cultural innovations of Cleopatra's reign also had lasting impact. Her identification with the goddess Isis contributed to the spread of Isis worship throughout the Mediterranean world, and the goddess became one of the most popular deities in the Roman Empire. The artistic and architectural styles developed in Ptolemaic Egypt influenced Roman art and architecture and contributed to the development of the distinctive visual culture of the imperial period. Modern archaeological research continues to reveal new aspects of Cleopatra's world and to challenge traditional interpretations of her reign. Recent discoveries in Alexandria and other Egyptian sites have provided new evidence about the material culture of Ptolemaic Egypt, the daily life of ordinary Egyptians during her reign, and the complex interactions between different ethnic and cultural groups in ancient Egypt. The search for Cleopatra's tomb, which has occupied archaeologists for more than a century, continues to generate new discoveries and new insights into the final years of the Ptolemaic dynasty. While the tomb itself remains undiscovered, the search has revealed numerous other important archaeological sites and has contributed to our understanding of Ptolemaic burial practices and religious beliefs. Recent advances in underwater archaeology have been particularly important for understanding Cleopatra's Alexandria. Large portions of the ancient city, including parts of the royal quarter where Cleopatra lived and ruled, now lie beneath the waters of Alexandria's harbour. Underwater excavations have revealed spectacular ruins, including possible remains of the famous lighthouse and other structures that were part of Cleopatra's world. The study of ancient DNA and other biological evidence has also begun to provide new insights into the population of Ptolemaic Egypt and the genetic heritage of the royal family. While much of this research is still in its early stages, it promises to shed new light on questions about ethnicity, migration, and cultural exchange in the ancient Mediterranean world. Modern scholarship has also benefited from new approaches to the study of ancient sources, including more sophisticated analysis of the biases and limitations of Greek and Roman historical accounts. Scholars have become more aware of the ways in which ancient authors shaped their narratives to serve contemporary political and cultural agendas, and they have developed new methods for extracting reliable historical information from sources that were written with clear partisan purposes. Feminist scholarship has been particularly important in challenging traditional interpretations of Cleopatra's story and in highlighting aspects of her reign that were previously overlooked or minimized. These new approaches have emphasized her agency as a political actor, her achievements as a ruler, and her significance as a representative of the sophisticated political culture of the Hellenistic world. The study of Cleopatra's reign has also benefited from new approaches to the history of the ancient economy, including more sophisticated analysis of trade patterns, monetary systems, and agricultural production. These studies have revealed the complex economic relationships that connected Egypt to the broader Mediterranean world and have provided new insights into the sources of Egypt's wealth and the strategies that Cleopatra used to maintain her kingdom's prosperity. As we continue to learn more about Cleopatra and her world, it becomes increasingly clear that she was far more than the romantic figure of popular imagination. She was a sophisticated political leader who governed one of the most important kingdoms of the ancient world during a crucial period of transition. Her reign represented the final chapter in the long history of independent Egypt and the end of the Hellenistic age that had begun with the conquests of Alexander the Great. The story of Cleopatra thus becomes not just the biography of a remarkable individual, but a window into the complex world of the ancient Mediterranean, with its intricate web of political alliances, cultural exchanges, and economic relationships. Her life and reign illuminate the challenges faced by all rulers of her time: the need to balance tradition with innovation, the difficulty of maintaining independence in an increasingly interconnected world, and the constant pressure to adapt to changing circumstances while preserving essential values and institutions. In the end, Cleopatra's greatest achievement may have been her success in maintaining Egypt's independence and prosperity for nearly 2 decades during one of the most turbulent periods in ancient history. Her defeat by Octavian marked the end of an era, but her legacy lived on in the institutions she had strengthened, the cultural traditions she had preserved, and the example she had set for future generations of leaders who would face similar challenges. The final saga of Cleopatra's story thus becomes a meditation on the nature of power, the complexity of human relationships, and the inevitable passage of time that transforms even the mightiest empires into memories and legends. Her tomb may remain undiscovered, but her influence on the world extends far beyond any physical monument. She lives on in the countless works of art, literature, and scholarship that have drawn inspiration from her story, and in the continuing fascination that her life and reign hold for people around the world. The sands of Egypt that once witnessed her triumphs and tragedies continue to shift with the desert winds, carrying with them the whispered memories of a civilization that once commanded the respect of the entire known world. Yet as the centuries passed after Cleopatra's death, her story underwent transformations that would have amazed even the Queen herself, who understood so well the power of image and narrative to shape political reality. In the immediate aftermath of her suicide, Octavian faced the delicate task of managing her memory and reputation. The new master of the Roman world understood that Cleopatra had been far more than a mere enemy to be defeated. She had been a symbol of an alternative vision of Mediterranean civilization, one that challenged Rome's claim to universal dominion. To simply demonize her memory would risk creating a martyr whose legend might inspire future resistance to Roman rule. Instead, Octavian and his propagandists crafted a more subtle narrative that acknowledged her charisma and abilities, while emphasizing the dangers that her foreign influence had posed to Roman virtue and stability. The poets of the Augustan age, writing under the patronage of the new imperial regime, played a crucial role in shaping this official interpretation of Cleopatra's legacy. Virgil's Aeneid, the great epic that celebrated the mythical origins of Roman civilization, depicted Cleopatra as a fierce and formidable enemy whose defeat by Augustus had been necessary for the establishment of Roman peace and prosperity. Horace, in his Odes, captured the ambivalent Roman attitude toward the Egyptian queen, acknowledging her courage in death while celebrating her downfall as a victory for Roman values. These literary treatments establish patterns of interpretation that would influence Western culture for centuries to come. Cleopatra became a figure who embodied both the allure and the danger of the exotic East, a woman whose beauty and intelligence had temporarily corrupted Roman virtue, but whose ultimate defeat had demonstrated the superiority of Roman civilization. This narrative served the political needs of the new imperial order, while also creating a compelling story that would fascinate later generations of readers and audiences. As the Roman Empire matured and evolved, new perspectives on Cleopatra began to emerge. Writers like Plutarch, who lived during the height of the Roman Empire in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, had access to sources that are now lost to us and could provide more nuanced accounts of her life and reign. Plutarch's parallel lives of Antony and Demetrius included extensive material about Cleopatra that revealed her as a complex political figure rather than simply a beautiful seductress. Plutarch's account acknowledged that Cleopatra's famous beauty might have been less important than her intelligence and charm. He described her as a woman who could speak 9 languages fluently and who was capable of discussing philosophy, mathematics, and literature with the leading intellectuals of her time. This portrayal suggested that her power over Caesar and Antony had been based on intellectual compatibility and shared political vision as much as on physical attraction. The rise of Christianity in the later Roman Empire brought new interpretative frameworks to bear on Cleopatra's story. Christian writers often used her as an example of the worldly vanity and sexual corruption that their religion sought to overcome. Yet even in these moralizing accounts, there was often an underlying recognition of her achievements as a ruler and her loyalty to her kingdom's interests. The tension between condemnation of her personal conduct and admiration for her political abilities would remain a constant theme in Christian treatments of her story. During the Byzantine period, when the Eastern Roman Empire maintained political and cultural continuity with the ancient world, Cleopatra's memory took on new significance. Byzantine scholars had better access to ancient Greek sources than their Western European contemporaries, and their accounts of her reign were often more historically accurate and less influenced by Roman propaganda. For the Byzantines, who saw themselves as the heirs of both Rome and the Hellenistic kingdoms of the East, Cleopatra represented not an alien threat, but a part of their own cultural heritage. The Islamic conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE brought yet another perspective to the interpretation of Cleopatra's legacy. Arabic and Persian writers, drawing on both Greek sources and local Egyptian traditions, created new versions of her story that emphasized different aspects of her character and achievements. In some Islamic accounts, she appeared as a wise and just ruler whose knowledge of science and philosophy made her a worthy successor to the ancient pharaohs. These interpretations were less concerned with the moral questions that preoccupied Christian writers and more interested in her contributions to learning and governance. The medieval period in Western Europe saw the transformation of Cleopatra's story into romance and legend. With limited access to ancient sources and little understanding of the historical context of her reign, medieval writers created fantastical accounts that bore little resemblance to historical reality. In these tales, she became a figure of pure romance, her political achievements forgotten in favor of elaborate descriptions of her beauty and her tragic love affairs. Yet even these romanticized accounts preserved some recognition of her significance as a historical figure. The medieval fascination with powerful women, from Empress Theodora to Eleanor of Aquitaine, created a cultural context in which Cleopatra could be celebrated as an example of feminine achievement, rather than simply condemned as a dangerous seductress. The troubadour tradition and the literature of courtly love found in her story themes that resonated with contemporary interests in the relationship between love and power. The Renaissance marked a crucial turning point in the interpretation of Cleopatra's legacy. The revival of classical learning and the development of more sophisticated historical methods allowed scholars to return to original ancient sources and to develop more accurate understandings of her life and times. Humanist scholars like Petrarch and Boccaccio began to study Plutarch and other ancient authors more carefully, leading to new appreciation for Cleopatra's political abilities and cultural achievements. The invention of printing made these new interpretations available to a much wider audience than ever before. Books about ancient history became popular among educated readers throughout Europe, and Cleopatra's story was retold in dozens of languages and hundreds of editions. This increased accessibility led to a proliferation of different interpretations, as writers and artists from different cultural backgrounds brought their own perspectives to bear on her story. The art of the Renaissance period reflected this renewed interest in classical antiquity and the complex figure of Cleopatra. Painters like Giambattista Tiepolo and sculptors like Michelangelo created works that depicted her as a figure of classical beauty and dignity, rather than as a simple object of exotic fascination. These artistic treatments helped to establish visual conventions for representing Cleopatra that would influence European art for centuries to come. The development of drama as a popular art form during the Renaissance provided new opportunities for exploring Cleopatra's story in depth. Playwrights from different European traditions created theatrical works that examined different aspects of her character and her historical significance. The French dramatist Robert Garnier's Marc Antoine and the Italian Cesare de Cesare's Cleopatra established many of the dramatic conventions that would reach their culmination in Shakespeare's masterpiece. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, written around 1607, represented perhaps the greatest artistic achievement inspired by her story. Drawing primarily on Plutarch's account, but transforming the historical narrative into a profound meditation on the nature of love, power, and political responsibility, Shakespeare created a Cleopatra who was neither the simple seductress of Roman propaganda nor the romanticized figure of medieval legend, but a complex character whose intelligence, passion, and political sophistication made her both admirable and tragic. Shakespeare's Cleopatra spoke some of the most beautiful poetry in the English language, from her famous description of her first meeting with Antony to her final speeches before her suicide. The playwright's genius lay in his ability to present her as simultaneously a great queen and a passionate woman, showing how her personal desires and her political responsibilities were inextricably intertwined. This psychological complexity made Shakespeare's version of her story the most influential interpretation in Western culture. The Age of Enlightenment brought new scholarly methods to the study of ancient history and new philosophical frameworks for understanding the relationship between individuals and historical forces. Enlightenment historians like Edward Gibbon approached Cleopatra's story with greater analytical rigor, attempting to separate historical fact from literary embellishment and to understand her reign in the context of the larger patterns of ancient Mediterranean politics. Gibbon's treatment of Cleopatra in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire exemplified the Enlightenment approach to historical writing. He acknowledged her intelligence and political skill, while also recognizing the limitations imposed on her by the circumstances of her time. His analysis emphasized the economic and military factors that had made Egyptian independence increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of Roman expansion, providing a more structural explanation for her ultimate defeat than the moralistic interpretations that had dominated earlier accounts. The Enlightenment also saw the emergence of new interest in ancient Egyptian civilization itself, rather than just in its Greek and Roman interpreters. Scholars began to study hieroglyphic inscriptions and to develop new understanding of pharaonic culture and religion. This research revealed the deep historical roots of the institutions and traditions that Cleopatra had inherited and had worked to preserve, providing new context for understanding her role as the last representative of an ancient civilization. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries brought yet another transformation to the interpretation of Cleopatra's legacy. Romantic writers and artists were drawn to the exotic and the passionate aspects of her story, creating works that emphasized emotion and imagination over historical accuracy. This period saw the creation of some of the most memorable artistic treatments of her story, from Berlioz's opera, Les Troyens, to Delacroix's painting, The Death of Cleopatra. The Romantic fascination with Cleopatra reflected broader cultural interests in the relationship between the individual and history, the conflict between reason and passion, and the tragic fate of exceptional individuals who defied conventional social expectations. For Romantic artists, her story provided a perfect vehicle for exploring these themes, while also indulging in the period's fascination with exotic settings and dramatic emotions. The 19th century also saw the beginning of modern archaeological research in Egypt, which began to provide material evidence for understanding ancient Egyptian civilization and the world in which Cleopatra had lived. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799 and its subsequent decipherment by Jean-François Champollion in the 1820s opened up vast new sources of information about ancient Egypt, allowing scholars to read hieroglyphic texts that had been written during and before Cleopatra's reign. Archaeological excavations in Alexandria and other Egyptian sites began to reveal the physical remains of Ptolemaic civilization, providing concrete evidence for understanding the material culture of Cleopatra's world. The discovery of papyrus documents in the dry sands of Egypt gave historians access to administrative records, legal documents, and private letters that illuminated the daily life of ordinary Egyptians during the Ptolemaic period. These archaeological discoveries gradually changed scholarly understanding of Cleopatra's reign and its historical context. Instead of relying solely on literary sources written by Greek and Roman authors, historians could now study Egyptian evidence that provided different perspectives on the same events and personalities. This new evidence often confirmed the intelligence and administrative ability that even hostile ancient sources had attributed to Cleopatra, while also revealing aspects of her reign that had been ignored or misunderstood by classical authors. The colonial period of the 19th and early 20th centuries brought European powers into direct control of Egypt and other parts of the former Ottoman Empire, creating new political and cultural contexts for interpreting Cleopatra's legacy. British, French, and other European scholars working in Egypt often approached her story through the lens of contemporary colonial relationships, seeing parallels between ancient Roman imperialism and modern European expansion into the Middle East and Africa. This colonial perspective sometimes led to interpretations that emphasized the benefits that Roman rule had brought to Egypt, portraying Cleopatra's resistance as futile opposition to the march of civilizational progress. Yet the same period also saw the emergence of new appreciation for the achievements of ancient Egyptian civilization, as archaeological discoveries revealed the sophistication and longevity of pharaonic culture. The discovery of spectacular archaeological sites like the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922 captured the popular imagination and reinforced public fascination with ancient Egypt. These discoveries provided new evidence for understanding the religious and cultural traditions that Cleopatra had inherited and had worked to maintain, while also revealing the artistic and technological achievements of ancient Egyptian civilization. The early 20th century saw the emergence of new artistic and literary movements that brought fresh perspectives to Cleopatra's story. Modernist writers and artists were less interested in historical accuracy than in using her story as a vehicle for exploring contemporary themes and concerns. This period saw the creation of works like George Bernard Shaw's play Caesar and Cleopatra, which used the ancient story to comment on modern politics and social relationships. The development of cinema as a popular art form provided new opportunities for bringing Cleopatra's story to mass audiences. Early films like the 1917 Cleopatra starring Theda Bara established many of the visual conventions that would influence cinematic depictions of the Egyptian queen for decades to come. These early films often emphasized the exotic and sensual aspects of her story, while paying less attention to historical accuracy or political complexity. The rise of feminism in the 20th century brought new interpretative frameworks to bear on Cleopatra's story, emphasizing her achievements as a female ruler in a male-dominated world and challenging traditional interpretations that had focused primarily on her relationships with Roman men. Feminist scholars argued that ancient sources had systematically minimized her political abilities because of contemporary prejudices against female leadership, and they worked to recover evidence for her genuine accomplishments as a ruler. This feminist reinterpretation of Cleopatra's legacy emphasized her success in maintaining Egyptian independence for nearly 2 decades, her sophisticated understanding of international politics, and her ability to navigate the complex religious and cultural traditions of her kingdom. Feminist scholars also pointed out that her defeat by Octavian had been the result of military and political factors rather than personal failings, and they argued that her story should be understood as an example of the structural challenges faced by all female leaders in patriarchal societies. The development of new archaeological techniques in the late 20th and early 21st centuries has continued to expand our understanding of Cleopatra's world and to provide new evidence for evaluating her reign and its significance. Underwater archaeology in Alexandria's harbour has revealed spectacular remains of ancient buildings and monuments, including possible remnants of the famous lighthouse and other structures that were part of Cleopatra's royal quarter. Advances in scientific analysis have allowed archaeologists to study ancient materials in unprecedented detail, revealing information about trade relationships, manufacturing techniques, and daily life in Ptolemaic Egypt. DNA analysis of mummies and other human remains has begun to provide new insights into the ethnic composition of ancient Egyptian society and the genetic heritage of the royal family. Remote sensing technologies like ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery have enabled archaeologists to locate new sites and to map ancient settlements and road networks. These techniques have been particularly important for research in Alexandria, where much of the ancient city now lies beneath the modern urban landscape or under the waters of the Mediterranean. The ongoing search for Cleopatra's tomb has become one of the most famous archaeological quests of modern times, capturing public imagination while also contributing to serious scholarly research about Ptolemaic burial practices and religious beliefs. While the tomb itself remains undiscovered, the search has led to numerous important discoveries that have enhanced our understanding of the material culture of Cleopatra's time. Modern scholarship has also benefited from new approaches to the study of ancient sources, including more sophisticated analysis of the cultural and political contexts in which ancient authors wrote their accounts. Scholars have become more aware of the ways in which ancient historians shaped their narratives to serve contemporary purposes, and they have developed new methods for extracting reliable information from sources that were clearly written with partisan intentions. The study of comparative history has provided new frameworks for understanding Cleopatra's reign and its significance within the broader patterns of ancient Mediterranean politics. Scholars have examined her story alongside those of other Hellenistic rulers and other female monarchs of the ancient world, revealing both the unique aspects of her situation and the common challenges faced by all rulers of her time. Digital humanities projects have made ancient sources more accessible to scholars around the world, while also enabling new forms of analysis that would have been impossible with traditional methods. Computer databases containing thousands of ancient inscriptions, coins, and papyrus documents allow researchers to identify patterns and connections that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. The globalization of scholarship has brought new international perspectives to the study of Cleopatra's legacy, as scholars from Africa, Asia, and other regions have contributed their own cultural viewpoints to the interpretation of her story. This international dialogue has challenged some of the assumptions and biases that had influenced earlier Western scholarship, while also revealing new aspects of her significance for understanding ancient Mediterranean civilization. Recent developments in ancient DNA research have begun to shed new light on questions about ethnicity and population genetics in the ancient world, including the genetic heritage of the Ptolemaic royal family. While this research is still in its early stages and many questions remain unanswered, it promises to provide new insights into the complex patterns of migration, intermarriage, and cultural exchange that characterize the Hellenistic period. The study of ancient climate and environmental history has also contributed to new understanding of the challenges that Cleopatra faced as a ruler. Research on ancient Nile flood patterns, Mediterranean trade routes, and agricultural productivity has revealed the environmental constraints within which all ancient Egyptian rulers had to operate, and the ways in which natural factors influenced political and economic developments. Modern conservation efforts have focused on preserving the archaeological remains of Ptolemaic Egypt for future study, while also making them accessible to the public through museums and cultural heritage sites. These efforts have revealed new information about ancient construction techniques, artistic traditions, and urban planning, while also raising important questions about the ethics of archaeological research and cultural heritage preservation. The impact of modern mass media and popular culture on perceptions of Cleopatra has been enormous, creating a global audience for her story, while also sometimes distorting historical understanding through sensationalized or inaccurate depictions. Films, television shows, novels, and other forms of popular entertainment have made her one of the most recognizable figures from the ancient world, while also perpetuating myths and stereotypes that can obscure her genuine historical significance. The internet and social media have created new opportunities for scholars to share their research with global audiences, while also enabling new forms of public engagement with ancient history. Online databases, virtual museum exhibitions, and educational websites have made high-quality information about Cleopatra and her world more accessible than ever before, while also facilitating international collaboration among scholars working on related topics. Contemporary political and social movements have continued to find relevance in Cleopatra's story, using her example to support arguments about female leadership, cultural diversity, and resistance to imperial domination. These modern appropriations of her legacy reflect the enduring power of her story to inspire and challenge people facing their own struggles for autonomy and recognition. The study of ancient rhetoric and political communication has provided new insights into Cleopatra's skills as a leader and negotiator, revealing the sophisticated strategies she used to maintain authority in a complex political environment. Analysis of ancient coins, inscriptions, and other official communications has shown how she crafted her public image to appeal to different audiences, while also projecting strength and legitimacy. Recent archaeological discoveries in Egypt and throughout the former territories of the Ptolemaic kingdom continue to provide new evidence for understanding the scope and sophistication of Cleopatra's realm. Excavations at sites like Taposiris Magna, where some scholars believe her tomb may be located, have revealed new information about Ptolemaic religious practices and burial customs, while also demonstrating the continued vitality of ancient Egyptian traditions during her reign. The development of new analytical techniques for studying ancient materials has enabled researchers to trace trade networks, identify sources of raw materials, and understand production processes in ways that were impossible for earlier generations of scholars. These methods have revealed the complex economic relationships that connected Egypt to the broader Mediterranean world, and have provided new evidence for Cleopatra's success in maintaining Egypt's prosperity during a period of political instability. Modern understanding of ancient psychology and social dynamics has also contributed to new interpretations of Cleopatra's relationships with Caesar, Antony, and other contemporary figures. Rather than viewing these relationships simply in terms of personal attraction or political calculation, scholars have begun to examine them as complex partnerships that reflected the social norms and expectations of their time, while also transcending conventional boundaries. The study of gender in the ancient world has provided new frameworks for understanding the challenges and opportunities that Cleopatra faced as a female ruler in a predominantly patriarchal society. Comparative studies of other ancient queens and female political leaders have revealed both the unique aspects of her situation and the common strategies that successful women use to exercise power in male-dominated political systems. Research on ancient religious practices and beliefs has enhanced understanding of Cleopatra's role as a pharaoh and her relationship with the traditional religious institutions of Egypt. Studies of temple inscriptions, religious art, and ritual objects have revealed the ways in which she maintained and adapted ancient religious traditions, while also incorporating new elements that reflected the cosmopolitan culture of the Hellenistic world. The examination of ancient economic systems and trade relationships has provided new insights into the sources of Egypt's wealth during Cleopatra's reign and the strategies she used to maintain her kingdom's prosperity. Analysis of ancient contracts, tax records, and other economic documents has revealed the sophisticated administrative systems that governed Egypt's economy and the complex network of relationships that connected Egyptian producers to Mediterranean markets. As our understanding of Cleopatra and her world continues to evolve through new research and new interpretative approaches, her story remains as compelling and relevant as ever. She continues to serve as a symbol of female achievement, cultural sophistication, and resistance to domination, while also representing the complex challenges faced by all leaders who must navigate between tradition and innovation, local loyalty, and international pressures. The ongoing dialogue between scholarly research and popular culture ensures that Cleopatra's story will continue to reach new audiences and inspire new interpretations. Each generation discovers new aspects of her legacy that speak to their own concerns and aspirations, while also contributing to the cumulative understanding of one of history's most remarkable figures. In the shifting sands where her kingdom once flourished, archaeologists continue their patient work of uncovering the material remains of her civilization. Each new discovery adds another piece to the complex puzzle of understanding her world and her achievements, while also raising new questions that will challenge future generations of scholars. The eternal Nile still flows through the landscape she once ruled, its waters carrying the same life-giving silt that sustained her kingdom's prosperity. The stars that guided her ships still shine in the Mediterranean sky, and the winds that filled her sails still blow across the ancient sea. In these enduring elements of the natural world, something of her presence seems to linger, reminding us that great lives, like great rivers, continue to shape the landscape long after their immediate course has ended. The final chapter of Cleopatra's story thus becomes not an ending, but a continuation. As each new generation rediscovers her significance and finds in her example inspiration for their own struggles and aspirations, her voice, speaking across more than 2 millennia, continues to remind us that the human capacity for achievement, love, and sacrifice transcends the boundaries of time and culture, connecting us to the eternal human story of which we are all a part.